Hello, hello. It is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today we have a special guest on the SonicScoop channel, one Mr. Jerry Hammack. Jerry joining us from Toronto, Canada. How are you doing today, Jerry?
Doing great, Justin. It's a pleasure to join you. I'm a big fan of the SonicScoop, so it's fun to, and I've learned a lot from it, so it's fun to be in a position to maybe give something back.
Awesome to hear. Great to have you on the channel. For those of you who don't know Jerry, he is one of the preeminent Beatles experts in the world. I think I can call you that because you've written like 5 books on the Beatles, and particularly how they worked in the studio, the recording techniques, their approaches to recording, the gear that they used, all of that. And now you're on your 6th book about the Beatles, which is called, let me bring it up on screen here, The Beatles Recording Techniques, Recreating the Classic EMI Studio Sound in Your Home Studio, or just the short version of the title, The Beatles Recording Techniques. So this is really interesting. In the past, you've done a whole bunch of books on specific Beatles albums and how they were approached, and now this is looking at them holistically throughout their entire career. Is that correct?
The difference between the Techniques book and the previous books, which were the Beatles recording reference manuals, is the reference manuals followed the creation of their catalog from first take to remix. That was the idea. So every single song that was in their official within the official releases in their contemporary period. So from 1962 to 1970. That's what that book did. It tracked their work in the studio to create these songs. So every take, all the gear that was used, how the songs came together, and includes diagrams that helps you understand the layout of the tapes and all of that. The difference with this one is that it takes it now into the realm of recording for people that are working in home studios or working in the studio and want to get that sound for themselves using modern tools. That's the idea here. So it's not a history lesson. It's a lesson in how to apply the Beatles again, techniques and tools to get your own, make your own tracks.
So this one is more of a practical guide, where the others are more of a history. And I think that's going to be relevant to our audience because we're going to be talking mostly to the people who are normally on the SonicScoop channel, producers, engineers, recording savvy musicians. So really up our alley. I want to start the conversation talking about process more generally, how they worked in the studio. And I think that's an important part of how the Beatles developed. But as we go further and further along, we'll get more and more nerdy and esoteric and talk about specific pieces of gear and maybe specific songs. If you guys have questions about your favorite albums, your favorite songs, type them in. I'm going to be saving the best questions for the second half of the podcast, and I want this to be driven as much by your questions as by mine. Before we get into some of the particulars on the Beatles, I've just got to give the quickest of shout outs to our sponsors. And our sponsors on this podcast, most important sponsor always, is you. How do you sponsor this podcast? It's easy. Hit the like button, hit subscribe. You can sponsor us with your love, or at least with your likes, because there is no love button currently. But you can hit like and you can subscribe. If you're on one of the audio-only versions of the podcast, consider giving us a 5-star rating and review. It really does help. But also, the best way to sponsor us, the 100% best way, is to sponsor yourself. And how can you do that? You can check out one of our great full-length courses, like Mixing Breakthroughs, Mastering Demystified, Compression Breakthroughs, EQ Breakthroughs. All these courses have a 30-day money-back guarantee. They are guaranteed to change the way that you work forever, for the better, or your money back. So check them out. These are easily the most useful things I've ever done in my entire life. So check them out. mixingbreakthroughs.com. That's the best place to start. If you don't have any of the courses, if you really want to learn compression or EQ inside and out, check out those courses. And also, big shout out and thanks to Sound Toys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. They have a whole bunch of really awesome sounding effects. Right now, they have a spring sale going on that actually ends today. So check them out, soundtoys.com. A whole bunch of their stuff is on sale for as much as up to 50% off. So go over there. There's plugins you can get as cheap as 30 or 40 bucks on here, or their whole bundle at a radically reduced price. So check those guys out as well. All right, without any more yakking about this stuff from me, let's get right back into our conversation with Jerry. So, Jerry, There's not one Beatles sound. There are how many years of Beatles sounds are there? They were really active over a period of just under a decade, right? So about 8 years worth of Beatles sounds with a whole bunch of different changes. How long is their career, and how
Yeah,
would you frame the eras that they each of these sounds come through?
yeah, you could look at them working from 1962 with My Bonnie recordings out through 1970 with the release of Let It Be. Um, the way that I tend to look at the eras of the Beatles' work is I think of an early period, and that includes everything from My Bonnie, done with Tony Sheridan, out through the Beatles for Sale in 1964. There's a middle period that follows that, which should be 1965 through 1966. That's going to be Help through Revolver, and this is where they started to mature as recording artists in the studio. It's also where they ended their by '66 they had ended their touring years. So now we follow that with an era all of its own, which is Sergeant Pepper and kind of psychedelia, and this would be 1967, including Pepper and including Magical Mystery Tour, which in my mind is an extension of the work of Pepper. It's Pepper and the Kitchen Sink. Um, Following that, in 1968, they transitioned to 8-track recording. They went from 4-track to 8-track recording, and this was the White Album era, and that was no less sophisticated than the work that they were doing, or innovative than the work they were doing in Pepper. It's just that the White Album, rather than being you know one theme, it explored a genre, and in that way, it was really expansive in terms of the sounds they got, because they were trying to do everything from little jazz bands to heavy rock to country music, the whole range of things. And then lastly, there's what I call the late period, which would be 1969 through 1970. That included the Get Back album and Abbey Road album. Uh, that's an era where there were a couple of things that were going on with them, where they started with a mission statement, if you want to look at that, for Get Back, that they were only going to record what a live band could record. They didn't actually follow that mission statement for too long. And then the way that I look at it, then they got back to what they really did well, which was Abbey Road, which was making a better pop album than anyone could make, and using all the tools at hand. And in that at that point, then there was also a change in technology that we can talk about as we go on. But that's essentially it. We have 5 eras, if you want to look at it that way.
Yeah. Now, I'm curious if you have favorite sounding records, and if when you're approached by people about their favorite Beatles sounds, if there's a particular era or particular set of albums that come up the most. While you're thinking about your answer to that question, I want to throw out mine. I think Sergeant Pepper's might be my favorite sounding Beatles album. Like, I think there was something at the end of the middle period and the beginning of this, later period, where there was just something in the sonics. Like, I listened to a song like A Day in the Life, and I feel like it could have been recorded yesterday, where there are some songs off of, like, I really like Revolver is definitely one of my favorite, Beatles albums. I like even some of the late pop stuff like Help. But there's something about the tone in that period around Sgt. Pepper and the surrounding albums that really speak to me. Do you have your own preferences that stand out to you, just as far as songwriting aside for a moment?
Revolver just always sticks with me. It's a great sounding album. It's just starting to get modern enough, if you can imagine that, where all the lessons that they had learned in their early era were truly mastered, and they were starting to stretch their legs a bit. And so in Revolver, I hear a lot of new sounds, and I like that. I like that sense that I get out of it. I agree with you entirely that Pepper is just a fantastic sounding, pop album any way you cut it. it's it's wonderful, the roundness of the bass that comes through in a way that it never had before, and how close and forward Emmerich's engineering
Hmm.
of the album is. Um, if I am as neutral as I can be about the Beatles, it's probably the White Album that overall is my favorite album, and I
Hmm.
think that is because of the range of it. You know, as I mentioned
Hmm.
in that earlier introduction, the fact that it covers so many genres and every one is convincing in its own way. Uh, that's a that to me is a rare feat,
Yeah.
and I think it speaks to the best of the Beatles.
Yeah, the White Album is fantastic. It has some of the more esoteric songs on it that I love, and some songs that are, you know, accessible hits as well. And I think one of the things we have to speak to before we get too heavily into the technology is the songwriting on these albums. One thing that people don't necessarily remember is that when you actually look at any Beatles album, you look at the liner notes and all the songs on it. I mean, there's hit after hit. There's well-known song after well-known song. Even the songs that aren't hits, songs that are. I mean, if you look at an album, even like Magical Mystery Tour, which isn't the first Beatles album that comes to mind for most people, practically every song on that album, most people's grandmothers could name. You know, and this is and the only songs for where that is not the case are like the instrumentals. So even if you take an album that isn't a best known album, most of those songs, most people who have been interested in music in the 20th century have heard. So one thing we have to give a lot of credit to is obviously the songwriting. We wouldn't be talking about the techniques and technology if it wasn't for the songwriting. And then one of the other things the Beatles were big on, with help from George Martin, the arrangements. Can you give us a sense, process wise, what led to these men being able to write this great of a number of amazing songs that have endured for decades after they've been written?
Well, they like a lot of great art. They were immersed in their own era. They were
Mm,
immersed in the work that was all around them. They were
hmm.
hearing, they were fans of the best of pop music, and with that, on top of that, they had a facility for taking the things that they loved and recombining them in a new way, or extending them in a way that the songs that they loved hadn't been. So they were both, they were great songwriters, but they were also great mimics in being
Hmm.
able to catch the lightning of other hits and put it in their own bottle, and turn it into Beatles lightning in a bottle.
Yeah.
So that was the fundamental of it. Uh, Another thing was that they were in a pressure cooker to produce. I don't know
Mm.
if most people are aware, but under their recording agreements, they had to produce 2 albums and 2 singles a year
Hmm.
for the UK market. That ended up being UK albums were 14 songs per album. So
Yeah.
there's 28 songs there and then 2 singles. So 28, 30, 32 songs a year on average, they were expected to write and record. Or,
Wow.
in some cases, of course, when they ran out of some steam, they'd record other people's kits. Primarily, uh, they did some Chet Atkins, if I'm remembering correctly. I
Hmm.
get sometimes I get lost in the details, folks, like everybody.
Hmm.
Um, but in general, the expected productivity under their contract was really, really high. And when you get working that consistently and that hard, you it tends to bring out. I think it tends to bring out the best in you. And
Hmm.
uh, when Ken Scott was interviewed about this and asked about why did the Beatles produce such consistent work and such good work? And he said is because they had to, because
Hmm.
they had that requirement on them to put out that much music. So they were working all the time, and obviously practice makes perfect.
Hmm.
Um, uh, and yeah, in today's when you look at it in relation to today's productivity, it's not even, it's inconceivable. Like you think of top pop artists now that will come out with an album every 2 or 3 years. There's a handful of exceptions, but in general, 2 to 3 to even up to 5 years between albums.
Yeah.
The Beatles' whole career, the Beatles' whole recording career, 1962 to 1970, 8 years. 8 years.
It's remarkable because there are artists, big artists, who have been around for 20 or 30 years who haven't had the output that the Beatles had in 8 years. And it is remarkable. And it's interesting because I think this is such a great point to bring up. So one thing that almost everything you described here is the opposite of the way most of us approach our craft as musicians, especially people who are hobbyists, but even a lot of professionals. And I want to speak to that for a moment because one of the things that I've noticed in a lot of artists is that they have no trouble with looking back to what the Beatles did, or they're imagining looking back to Robert Johnson or Leadbelly or whoever and pulling from the past. And that's wonderful. And you should have influences that are not of today, so you don't sound just like everyone else. But by the same token, they were students of contemporary popular culture, contemporary popular music, and what was happening, what their contemporaries were doing. And sometimes I like to joke that whenever I poll musicians about their favorite musicians are almost always dead musicians because they're not competition, And no one wants to like a band that's in their same kind of general wavelength, doing the kind of thing that they're doing and maybe slightly better. We hate those bands by default, but they somehow were able to turn that into this kind of positive competition, like thinking about them listening to the Motown records of the time or the Beach Boys records of the time. And instead of being annoyed by these guys who could be competition, they were inspired by their competition somehow. So I find that fascinating. Can you speak to any ways in which that came across in their recordings or in their productions? To my understanding, we were talking earlier about how they really listened to some of the Capitol records. And we're saying, well, how come we can't have a low end like that on our releases? How do we do that? Can you give us some sense for how things like that developed?
Well, yeah, for sure. They loved the early Phil Spector girl group music, and they recorded a few girl group tunes. "Boys" is a girl group song. They loved that music that Spector was producing, so they tried to make their better version of what Spector was doing. That was natural to them. They loved the Beach Boys. A lot of people believe that Pepper is a response to Pet Sounds. Mm-hmm. That they're trying to top each other. If anyone's watched the Get Back documentary that Peter Jackson did, you'd hear all throughout it where the Beatles are talking about current artists that are on the charts and how much they like those songs that they're hearing. Canned Heat. They're digging all this kind of music, and so it was very natural to them to see themselves as part of a whole scene. It wasn't the Beatles and everybody in the fullness of time. I think we tend to put the Beatles off in their own category, but in the Beatles' time, they didn't see themselves that way. They saw themselves as another rock band trying to do great music. While they were set apart because of their success, they loved the Monkees.
Yeah, I love the Monkees, but go on.
I do too. The Beatles love the Monkees. I think I want to say, Mike Nesmith was at the Day in the Life session. I think.
Wow, yeah.
So they hung out with each other. They were just sponges for the music they loved. They loved their contemporaries. They had relationships with them. If anyone is old enough to remember the idea that there was some battle between the Beatles and the Stones, absolutely, in the fans' mind there might be, but in the Beatles' minds there weren't. The Beatles loved the Stones. Again, Mick Jagger. Mick Jagger is there at All You Need Is Love, sitting in the front row, singing backing vocals.
Yeah. So
Yeah, so they were
this is
very
big
much a part of their
lesson.
time.
Yeah, this is big lesson number one for me, that it's so easy to get cynical about popular music that's around you. But I think to be successful in making popular music that's going to resonate with a lot of people, you have to be able to find what's good about popular music today and not just be a critic of popular music today. And if you can only be a critic of popular music today, there's probably some cynicism that's going to hold you back in your art. So that's one big lesson for me in what you've said in these opening remarks. A second big lesson for me in these opening remarks is that some of us get too afraid and too precious about our creations. We feel like we only have one album's worth of great material in us, so that's all that we ever make. And people sometimes sit on an album's worth of material for an entire lifetime. You don't know how many times I've mastered records for people or coached for people who are like, I'm 50 now and I finally want to get out this album that I've been brewing for the past 30 years. And I can totally understand that. You spent most of your life having a day job and all that, and these are the songs you've created over your life. But when I see young people have that same attitude of, this is my magnum opus, this is all that there will ever be, this will be my best work forever, in a way, I guess you maybe have to feel a little bit of that way about what you're working on, but you have to realize that you're going to create so much more art over your life, and you can't start the next project until you finish this one. And putting yourself on a schedule like the Beatles had, if you put yourself on a schedule where you have to write a song every month because you've promised that to yourself, or you have to release 6 songs a year or 12 songs a year, that can make you more creative rather than turn you into a hack who's just trying to get through it, because the pressure and the limitations can make you more creative rather than less, I think.
Yeah, deadlines are critical to the creative arts, self-imposed or externally imposed. There's nothing better for you than a deadline, because a deadline forces you to make decisions. In the Beatles' earliest work in the studio, when they went into EMI recording studios in the early 60s, the expectation was that they would go in for a 3-hour session, which was the standard block, and they would come out with 2 sides. They'd come out with a single. And within a few weeks, that single was out in the marketplace. That was the way things were done. You went into a recording studio to finish a song. And so that was a built-in mindset. You prepared for a session with the idea that when I get that precious studio time, I'm going to make my hit. And everyone that went through the EMI system, that was the expectation. We weren't going to hang out and experiment and see what happens. Now, later in the Beatles' career, of course, when they became, the most successful commercial acts, they got some leeway to spend some time playing and experimenting. But there was always a point, even in that era, where, hey guys, albums due, albums due in 3 weeks, get it done. Not making decisions, not moving ahead, not looking toward the completion of a work, not building your own recording process in a way that you're moving toward a finished work. I think it will lessen the impact of whatever comes out. Making decisions, making commitments, building on those commitments as you move forward in your recording process is the way that the classic hits that we all love, that's the way they were made.
Yeah. Well, another question for you here that you've started to touch on that is becoming a little bit of a lost art. The way that the Beatles had to do things originally is that they would have had to have a pre-production process, meaning that they're creating a song that's good enough to stand on its own without any studio trickery, rehearsed to a point where the performances are there. They're not going to have to go in and do 20 vocal takes because they already have the song working, and they're going into the studio to do a final recording. And what so many of us today end up doing, because we have the ability to, is that there's sometimes not a dividing line between pre-production and production. We start writing the song as we think we're recording the final version of it. We're practicing the vocal as we're writing the vocal. This is how some people who are really daw forward, and some types of music necessitate this approach, perhaps electronic music genres where you're, relying heavily on samples and the like. But do you think that there is some value or some benefit to having these two distinctly separate processes of pre-production and recording for real? And is that something the Beatles did their whole career? Did that stop at a certain point?
It never completely stopped. Again, they did have opportunities that at the time were very rare to experiment within the studio, but they almost exclusively came in to the studio with a song.
Mm-hmm.
The songs, the song is in its final form or very very close to its final form when they come in to do the work of recording it. I believe pre-production is key and critical, if only to understand your song up to the point of the backing track.
Mm-hmm.
The foundation that you're going to work from. If only understanding it up to that point it's critical. It moves you so quickly forward in creating a sound, in establishing a vibe, in establishing the groove, and again, everything then that you do beyond that is built on a solid foundation. That's the
Mm-hmm.
idea. If you go in without this work done, you've never really started with a foundation. And the Beatles, throughout almost the entirety of their career, they recorded their backing tracks as a group.
Mm-hmm.
So they were group performances, all through their career, and it shows. You get that certain something when you've got a group of musicians working together, working off of each other, and they came into the studio ready to do that. And I think for people that are working now, again, even though you can do without it, and even though there are genres of music that are fully additive, meaning you don't know what you're doing next until you've done this.
Mm-hmm.
Done some aspect of it. Beyond that, pre-production is your best friend. It gives you a roadmap. It gives you a roadmap. It helps you again get to that point of completion much faster.
And I imagine it was also necessary for the kind of process that they had with George Martin, who took in many cases sketches of really good songs that the Beatles had created and turned them into the kind of forward-looking pop arrangements and enduring pop masterpieces that people credit the Beatles for. So when would George Martin have come in? Would they be recording demos that he would then, or is he working off of lead sheets? What was that handoff procedure like between we've created a song and now we want this fully fleshed out? Is he doing that after the whole song's been recorded, off of pre-production demos? At what point is George Martin stepping in and adding his orchestrations and doing these kinds of things?
So the band's coming in with a song written into the studio, and they referred to Martin a lot most of the time as Mr. Martin. So think of that hierarchical relationship that they had with the producer. So the first thing that they're doing is they're playing the song for their producer. Here's the song we want to do, and he takes his arrangers and his arranger's ear to this and producer's ear to it, and helps them refine that initial vision of the track. The Beatles couldn't write music in the traditional form, or they didn't come in with lead sheets or anything like that. They came in with lyrics, and like a lot of us do, lyrics in a chord progression, yeah. And they'd come in with that. But again, they came in with the song that they wanted to record. He would respond to that and help them with things like pacing and tempo and voicing, if you want to think of it in the orchestral sense of helping them refine the relationship between the instruments that they've got on it, even if it's just a couple of guitars, bass, and drums. He would work with them to ensure that there's interplay and counterpoint between the two guitars, that the bass added value to this, or momentum to it, that the groove worked with the track. It wasn't just a drum part; it worked with the song. That was the role that he played right from the start.
Very cool. And now I could talk about some of this process stuff even further, but I want to start to gently segue into some of the more technical side of things. And at a certain point, maybe we could talk about things from the perspective of an engineer and what a working day might be like for them in the studio. But first, I want to talk about some specific sounds. And I think a few sounds that we can look at that may have changed over the years. Some of the ones to look at would be bass sounds, drum sounds, vocal sounds, to think about how the equipment that was used might be different, or how the aesthetics over this 8-year period changed. So, as we started to allude to earlier, the sound of the bass on the earliest Beatles records, such as, if you're listening to Shout or something like this, their very early Beatlemania period, is quite different than the more forward role that some of the bass took later on. Could you tell us how bass evolved on Beatles records? Specifically, do the instrumentation and the amplifiers ever change, or is most of this coming from mixed decisions and ways of recording the instrument? And what changes the sound of the bass over this 8-year period for the Beatles?
Well, to start, in their earliest recordings, you have to remember that they were working in mono and twin track, so yeah. two entire tracks, and let's be generous and give them those 2 tracks. And in that instance, then the entire backing track, the whole band, drums, 2 guitars, bass guitar, are all on one single track of audio. Mm-hmm. So the balance engineer's job there is to get as good a representation of that overall feel of the group, of a live group, onto one track of audio. And so that impacted the sound. You can't have too much bass because I'm going to be crowding up other frequencies. Maybe the frequencies the drums is occupying. I have to use microphone placement in order to step out guitars, for instance. That's what impacted the earliest sound, was the fact that they had such limited output for it. That's landing, the whole band's landing on a single track of audio. In the earliest iterations, McCartney was using a power amp and a speaker from one of the echo chambers at EMI, because his own gear was such crap gear, they wouldn't let him record with it. It was too noisy. And he used that actually through the entire Please Please Me album was done with a Tannoy speaker and a Leak 25-watt amp that was assigned to Echo Chamber 2.
25-watt bass amp. I can't even imagine it in this day and age.
Again, why those early records sound the way they do is because the balance engineer was trying to get a clear representation of all the tones onto a single track.
Yeah.
Now, as they moved on in their career into 4-track, it was generally still the process that they would have a majority of the backing track would only take up 1 track of audio. So a common 4-track layout might be that you've got a guitar, bass, and drums on 1 track. You have another guitar on another track, and then vocals on, say, track 3 out of track 4, and overdubs on track 4 out of track 4. Again, it's these groupings, the groupings of instruments. They certainly progressed in the amplifiers that they were using, because as they got popular, they got sponsored like everybody else. So Vox was giving them amplifiers to use. Eventually, Fender was giving them amplifiers to use, and they, like every other musician that we know, were like, new amplifier. I'm going to record with that one. And it was the same with instruments themselves. McCartney started his work with a Hofner 500-1 bass, and he went through a couple models of that. Well, at one point, Rickenbacker offers him a bass, and he's like,
Mm-hmm.
"Sure, I'll take that bass." It
Mm-hmm.
ends up, it ends up being the sound of, starting with Revolver. It starts to it's taking its place. Actually, it's taking its place earlier. It's taking its place in not Beatles for Sale, but come on, this is my memory. Rubber Soul.
Yeah, sure.
It starts to take its place, um,
Mm-hmm.
and it's an entirely different bass sound, right?
Yeah. Rubber Soul and Revolver is where the Beatles, for me, start to tip. And you could put it at either of those albums where they really start to tip into sounding like more modern productions do, and where they start on both those albums start to become a little bit more experimental. Like, in addition to having great songs, we're starting to kind of expand the palette of what you'd expect in Western recordings.
Yeah, and here's the other big change. Again, keeping in mind that they're working in 4 track. When uh, you get to Rubber Soul, they're starting to push the boundaries of the 4 track. They're no longer able to get the sounds that they want, to follow the song where they want to follow it, without doing what are called tape reduction remixes,
Mm-hmm.
without running out of space on the 4 track. And when they ran out of space, what they would do is they would get another tape machine with another blank 4 track tape, and they would do a mix. They
Mm-hmm.
would do a mix of the initial 4 track to the new 4 track machine, having that mix result in fewer than 4 tracks, sometimes only 1 track. Sometimes they take the entire contents of a 4 track and bounce it down to 1 track on a new tape. But
Mm-hmm.
uh, when they're doing that, they were performing a mix.
Yeah.
So everything that might be involved in a mix, of echo chamber or plate reverbs, additional compression, uh, you know tonal work, equalization work. They were doing all of that as they moved from one tape to the next, and then that tape became the new baseline for that they would work. They would work from. So that's the other change is as you get to Rubber Soul, they're outgrowing it. When you get to Revolver, they've outgrown it. When you get to Pepper, they've really outgrown it. And at that point, they were doing 2 to 3 tape reduction remixes before they get to a finished song. There are tracks on Pepper that are comprised of 19 to 20 performances,
Mm-hmm.
and so you'll always hear people going, "Oh, the Beatles, Beatles, they were able to do that on 4 track. Why can't you do it, in your DAW?" Well, kind of 4 track,
Mm-hmm.
but kind of not 4 track. Um, so all of those things impacted it. If I know that I am going to have room going forward, then I can give the bass its own track now. So that also, impacts the sound that I'm going to get. I know because I'm going to do a tape reduction that, maybe I'll wait and I'll do the bass after I've done the reduction, and now the bass can have its, entirely its own thing, all its own. And there were cases where that was the way that they handled the recordings, where the bass was one of the last elements that was recorded.
Yeah. And then I remember you saying something along the lines of them being in competition with Capitol and for how much bass they could put on records, that the Americans were putting more low end on their records. And you said that there was a kind of a difference in standards to a degree also that led to a difference in how forward the bass would have been mixed. Can you expound on that a little further?
Sure, record manufacturing is manufacturing, and so manufacturing engineers are going to develop their set of specifications for frequency content that they know they can safely, routinely, predictably get to vinyl. The U.S. standards were different from the U.K. standards. The U.S. standards, they felt safer in pushing more bass into the grooves than they did in
Mm-hmm.
the UK. They just they were worried. They were worried in the UK that if they got too much bass going, that needle would start vibrating. Those low frequency vibrations would pop the needle out of the groove.
Mm-hmm.
And for people that understand that physical format, that's that's one aspect of it. When you go to the high frequency content, there's a limitation because when you're cutting that groove, if that peak is trying to capture too high of frequencies, that peak can break off when you're playing it. If you're trying to get too much high end into the signal. So again, they were more conservative in their mastering to disc in the UK than they were in the US,
Right.
and that resulted in a different overall tonality.
Yeah, and I wonder if, this is just the British being too stodgy and not adventurous enough compared to the Americans, or if it ends up being a thing where it's like, hey, when these standards were first created, we were using, needle tips on cartridges that were so much more brittle that had a greater chance of breaking off or a greater chance of jumping up off the thing. And as the technology evolved and the common consumer hi-fi system might have playback devices where that becomes less of an issue, that maybe the Americans were able to catch up with those improving consumer standards in their process faster than the British were able to, maybe for cultural differences or whatever random differences may have existed. Do you think there's any possibility to that were these standards always too conservative, or was there a time when they were appropriate, but then they outlived their usefulness?
Well, I think early on they were appropriate. I mean, it's well known that EMI was the furthest thing from a fast follower that you can imagine.
Right.
It wasn't that they were like, hey, what's going on over at Capitol? Let's do that. They didn't think that way. They thought, hey, this is how we make records. It works, and this is how we're going to make records. And so, much to the Beatles' frustration, took a long time for them to get to 4-track, a relatively long time. Why? Well, because 4-track was for orchestral recordings. It wasn't for pop recordings. Pop recordings shouldn't take more than two tracks of audio. It's just a band and a singer. Why do you need any more than that?
It's so funny because the common wisdom is the other way around these days, where it's like, if you're doing an orchestral recording, why do you need more than 2 tracks? You should be able to capture that completely stereo. You make your mic choices on the way in with good monitoring, and you're done. But man, you're making a pop production. You need 150, 180 tracks. Maybe that would be a start,
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, it's definitely flipped on its head. Now, an interesting aspect of this, though, is that, in contemporary, so if we're talking about if we're in the 60s here, a lot of US artists wanted their albums and songs to sound like the UK recordings.
Yes.
In the same way that the artists in the UK wanted their stuff to sound like the American recordings. It's just, maybe it's that you want what you don't got. That desire of otherness, and if my stuff can't possibly sound good, their stuff sounds great, and they're looking right back at you, and they're looking right back at you across the pond and saying, oh, no, your stuff sounds great. We wish ours was doing that. It's kind of a natural thing, I suppose, but certainly it was as much a process related to manufacture that built in some of the limited tones that we hear in the earliest of the Beatles' work.
Yeah. All right. Now, another big question I have around here is vocals. And I think one of the things that you're hinting at here with vocals is it's so much different than the way that we often record vocals today, where we have multiple overdubs, many different takes that will comp together from. People would rarely even dream of putting 2 singers around the same microphone to record. But the way that the Beatles would have recorded would have been very different, often with harmonies worked out in advance. The distances from microphones might be different. Can you give us a sense of what would be different for the overall Beatles kind of vocal approach compared to a cookie cutter conventional vocal approach that we might be expected to take today in the studio?
Well, I mean, again, commitments were made right up front, and signal chains were extremely limited. This goes for every kind of signal they were recording. With vocals, it was common that they were going to be using a Neumann U48 microphone. That microphone in a cardioid pattern or a figure of eight, if there's Lennon and McCartney are singing around it at the same time. That's going into their red console, where it's getting level adjustment, and it's getting tonal adjustment. And those early consoles, the red consoles, you could think of it like a hi-fi. All it had was bass and treble. That's all they were working with in terms of tone adjustment. And then on its way to tape, it would be run through a Fairchild limiter. That's the entire signal chain. And they print that, and that's your vocal. So sort of the things that we do now with parallel compression and multi stages of compression, where we will DS and do all of these advanced things to control it, where we will comp tracks. They weren't doing that. It was they would practice the vocal till they had a solid performance. They would track it with this limited signal chain. They would commit to it. They would print it, and you're on to the next work.
Yeah, I think this is one of the big lessons that so many of us could learn in the studio, is to do pre-production on vocals to the point where you're treating it like a performer who's going to be on stage, where you could say, man, I wish I had recorded that for real. That was great. Or where you get even so far beyond that, where you say, another great take like always. I could have recorded that one like any of the others. Now let's go into the studio. And I think that's where people are able to become really human and give engaging vocal performances, because sometimes we get obsessed about, the pitch of our vocal performances, or the diction of our vocal performances, or the timing of our vocal performances. And really what people care about is whether there is a convincing human emotion being conveyed that they can identify with. And I think you can only really get there if you can sing the thing like you were ready to get up on stage and sing it just like any other night of the week. And I figure that's the stage they're getting to with these vocal performances. They know how it's going to be sung. They don't have to go in and do 20 takes and hope that a stitch of take 18, 19, and 20 are going to be the one, right? That process was done on a different day rather than necessarily the day that they're finishing the recording.
Yeah. Now, the Beatles weren't perfect.
Sure.
And many of their songs are constructions.
Sure.
Our edits and multiple performances. But yeah, the idea behind it was that you were just that word, you're performing it. You're not singing the vocal part, you're performing the vocal part.
Right.
So you know it well enough. And I personally, I believe that in terms of pre-production work, that should always be the goal in mind, is I'm getting past the point of playing the part. I'm getting to the point of performing the part. I know the part. I know the part well enough that I'm past technique. I'm past I'm past the rudiments of getting it right, and I'm performing it. I'm telling a story. I'm telling a story with it. Famously, McCartney went in on multiple days to do the lead vocal for "Oh Darling" on the Abbey Road album, and he wanted this, like I've got right now from allergies. he wanted this gravel, this certain level of gravel that came in his voice, and he felt that he only had it when he on the first one or two times that he sang the song.
Yeah.
So go into the studio at this time, he would go into the studio then before anyone else was in the studio, and he would try to get that feeling into the song. It wasn't trying to hit the notes. He could hit the notes all day long. He was trying to get the feeling. He was trying to perform it a certain way. And to me, that's all the difference. Now, the final performance is a comp of
Sure.
multiple performances, um, but they were only used because they captured the feeling he wanted in the track.
Yeah. No, that makes sense to me. Now, sticking on vocals for a little bit longer, I think part of the Beatles' vocal tone is obviously the microphones that they used and the all the front end that they're going through. And towards the end, we'll talk maybe about some plugins or modern gear that is appropriate for recreating Beatles-specific sounds. But some of the other things would be the kind of room environment that they're in. We're not necessarily in small padded rooms. We're in relatively large rooms for a vocal booth. We're at maybe slightly further distances than average recording distances today. I think that would be a factor. I'm also curious about two other things. One would be effects, and two would be whether the vocal processing and tools used were different based on different singers. Like, are Paul McCartney, John Lennon, George Harrison, Ringo Starr all using the same exact chain, and the differences we're hearing are the differences in tone of their voice, or are they doing anything along the lines of, here's the chain that we have for Lennon, and here's the chain that we have for McCartney, and so on? Are there different technical considerations for each of the singer, or is it like, here's what we do for vocals, now you people sing and just sound like you?
It's here's what we do for vocals.
Yep.
It's that mic, that vocal mic is set up, so that's the one you sing into. It's so something to, again, for background to understand about the recording environment. There is a highly regimented studio system that went on, that management system of the work of recording at EMI. You had recording engineers, which aren't the same in the modern parlance. These were the technical guys that could break down stuff, take it apart, put it back together. They were responsible for all of the patching that would go on. They were responsible for setting up microphones. They were responsible for all of that work of the session today is going to include, 3 AKG D19Cs. It's going to include 2 U47s. It's going to include an STC and a D20. They knew the mics that were going to be there, where they would be placed. They knew the signal routing, and they would wire it all up. They would do all of that. So, and then you had the balance engineer, like Jeff Emmerich, who ran the console. So was responsible for managing the tones of the console. You had a tape operator whose primary job was play, record, rewind, fast forward, and switch tapes. Right? They shall not meet. You're the tape operator. You will not move my microphone. If you want a microphone moved, you will call me, and I will move your microphone for you. So there's the environment that they're working in. So, if a vocal mic's set up, that's the vocal mic you use. Kind of the end. And if a vocal chain or a chain is set up, again, microphone via patch bay to console, once again, console via patch bay to external compressor or limiter, and then that to tape. That's it. It's patched. That's how we record it.
Yeah,
And
I hear you.
didn't matter who was singing.
Well, let's get in now to some of the nerdier stuff for the people who are more interested on the engineering side, the mixing side, specific tools and effects. So starting with the things that are maybe most audible, things like reverbs and delays that we might use on vocals or other instruments. What were some of the most common Beatles effects to be added in the mixing process or in the recording process? And did that change over the years?
Yeah, it changed a little, but didn't change much. So in the earliest years, they took advantage of echo chambers, and there were 3 chambers at EMI. There's one left, chamber 2, but there were three chambers that they had access to, and I'm sure your audience understands how an echo chamber works. You send a signal to a speaker in a room that's reverberant. You put a microphone in that room. You capture the signal that's bouncing around the room. You bring it back into the console. You mix it with the original signal. that's an echo chamber.
Mm-hmm.
So that was where they started. And the early recordings are pretty much exclusively echo chamber in terms of the reverb effects. They also used they used tape delay as part of it. So they had access to things like slap back echo and echo delay as well, where depending on the tape speed and the position of the playback head in relation to the original signal that they could mess with. And these are, slapback's a very classic early recording effect. They used that. As they progressed, then the systems that they used to create tape delay were innovated on, and they created what was called artificial double tracking.
Mm-hmm.
Lennon in I think '66 was complaining to George Martin that he didn't like having to sing parts twice.
Mm-hmm.
He was a very impatient man in the studio and didn't like singing parts twice. Why do I have to sing that twice? And Ken Townsend, the lead recording engineer, figured out a way that he could use the existing tape delay system, teaming it with an oscillator that he could vary very closely the delay to the original signal, and with um, the oscillator controlled a power amp. The power amp changed the speed, like vary speed, if people are familiar with that term.
Mm-hmm.
Basically put vary speed on the tape delay, and as you got close in, you could be a little bit faster, a little bit slower than the original part, and magically it sounds like two people actually singing.
Sure. So
So
these are
artificial
delays with some type of pitch and time modulation percentage, which are very common things that we expect to find delays today. Shout out to SoundToy, sponsor of this podcast. You can check out their Echo Boy plugin, but they, like so many others, have these kinds of things where you'd have some type of tape emulation, and then the ability. Well, first of all, we're talking about very short delays here for automatic double tracking. We're probably talking about Haas effect range of 40 or 50 milliseconds, I'd imagine. Do you know the exact delay times they're using for these ADT techniques off the top
I,
of your head?
I don't know the specific times, and they're actually beyond the Haas effect.
Mm-hmm.
They
Gotcha.
were audible. They were audible differences.
Right. So that would be above 50 milliseconds, or maybe in the 60 to 80 millisecond range, where it starts to almost get into slapback type echo. Slower versions of that make me think of Johnny Cash, and maybe slightly faster versions of that make me think of something like John Lennon. But were they always using this? Was there a period where automatic double tracking and even doubling vocals in general was the trend, the thing to do, and at a certain point did they abandon it? Because not all of John Lennon's vocals sound double tracked, and some do. So is this a period by period thing or a song by song thing, the prevalence of double tracking?
It's with a lot of the Beatles' use of enhancements or effects, however you want to think of them. They were very much flavor of the month.
Mm-hmm.
So I've discovered artificial double tracking. Let's do it on everything,
Yes.
right? I've just and that is the way that they worked when they started working when they discovered reverse audio.
Mm.
When they started reverse everything, I want to hear that on everything. When they discovered phasing and flanging, when they discovered the use of when they started to use the Leslie speaker
Mm-hmm.
as a guitar amplifier, let's put everything through the Leslie.
Yeah.
That's just the way. It's just the way they worked.
Yep. So for delays, most of the delays they would have been using would have been tape-based delays at that time.
They
For
were.
reverbs, there are three different chambers at EMI.
Yep.
Were there also anything in the way of plate reverbs or other?
No. Yeah.
And would
Yeah,
those
they
have
had.
been there from the beginning, or does that start to creep in at a certain period?
Well, they had the EMT 140 plates. They had
Mm-hmm.
four of them.
Mm-hmm.
One of them was tube amplified. The balance of them were solid state amplified. They were available to them from the get go. They were there in the late 50s, early 60s. They didn't start using them until Pepper.
Mm.
So
And was there a philosophy about why they would start using the plate reverbs? And once they started to integrate them, was there a philosophy behind what kinds of sounds would be plate reverbs and what kinds of sounds would be chamber reverbs?
Again, they kind of followed their nose to tones that they liked, and so the great thing that you have with a plate versus a chamber is that in this era is that concept of pre-delay and the control that you get with the ability to pre-delay, and also the artificial chamber with the artificial reverb, the plates, your control over the time and the decay and that is much more finessed. Once they recognized they could use that, then again that became more of the go-to. They they weren't precious about any of this, and they didn't have and they certainly didn't have rules. What they had more was routines. If it works, it works. We'll do it. The Beatles had and EMI Studios had a very limited toolkit.
Yeah.
Exceptionally limited by today's standards. Think of it as chamber. I've got tape delay. I've got vary speed. I've got double tracking. I've got phasing and flanging. That's my, let's see, that's my handful. And
Yeah.
how they innovated was in different combinations, different applications of those of that very limited toolkit. That's how
it's funny because they weren't precious about it, but we're so precious about it today that so many people, almost to the point where people think, I can't make a record yet because I don't have the right XYZ. But yeah, it is amazing to see them just embracing, here's what we have, let's make music. And I think this is something that more of us, rather than having to recreate the Beatles toolkit, one of the things we can take from them is, hey, here's the gear to use if you want to sound like the Beatles. But another thing that you could take from it is, here's how you should think about making music if you want to make music like the Beatles. And it doesn't necessarily involve having exactly the right tools.
No, it doesn't. And an area where this is particularly applicable is in microphones.
Mm-hmm.
No one listening to your record can tell if you used a U48 or just a good, clear, large diaphragm condenser. And no one listening to your release is going to go, was that recorded on a Samson?
Right.
No one's doing that. No one's doing that. And what microphones did the Beatles use? Again, let's recall a lot of their work was recorded on these inexpensive at the time AKG D19C dynamic microphones. And why did they choose that microphone in a lot of instances for all sorts of applications? They chose it because it was plugged in.
Yeah. Yep. I hear you.
So,
and this is, it's funny that these would have been relatively inexpensive microphones then. If you were to make something similar today, it wouldn't cost a lot to make a microphone with similar performance. But I'm bringing up price charts for people here. Let's see if I can bring them up on screen right now. These are microphones because of their vintage history that are selling, for $1,000, $1,800 for a pair in amazing shape, $750. Where the actual, it's funny, right next to I'm seeing pictures of the Electro Voice 635A, which is, similar in construction, priced used at $150. Sometimes a lot of this difference comes from prestige value or collector's value rather than what it's sonically capable of. And that's something we have to remember.
Yeah, it certainly does. Now, not all, majority of microphones have coloration to them.
Sure.
And that's, that's just based off of how they receive the signal, how they're manufactured, the components in that. How much difference does the coloration make to what you're capturing? proportionally, it ain't great. And
Yes.
most contemporary microphones, contemporary affordable microphones, far exceed the specifications available in the vintage microphones. They've got lower noise floors. They've got all sorts of desirable things for modern recordings.
Hmm.
If you want to add noise.
One of the
You don't,
interesting
don't need to do it at the source.
Well, yeah, one of the interesting things about this is sometimes when we're seeking vintage gear, we're not seeking vintage gear because it is technically superior. It's because it has a coloration that's familiar to us because we've heard that specific coloration on so many records that it seems right. It sounds like it's already been recorded because it sounds like recordings that we're familiar with. But arguably, those microphones only sound that way to us. They only sound familiar to us if they do at all because of the music that's been recorded through them. It's not the other way around.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I think we layer on, as we understand it as engineers, producers, we understand how these recordings were made. We assign a value to those tools that don't necessarily deserve.
Hmm.
Uh, but but there's another aspect of this, which is
Yeah.
they're inspiring.
Yeah,
They're
there's that.
inspiring
And
to
by the
you.
same token, there are certain colorations that are somewhat unique and really. So one thing that stands out to me is so She Said off Revolver. Revolver is easily one of the best Beatles albums ever. It has some of the greatest songs on it. It's really bridges early Beatles to later Beatles. She Said is one track that stands out to me because it's one of the first examples that I can think of what sounds like intentional overcompression on drums, where you have these cymbal crashes on She Said, that almost sound like a reverse cymbal. Like the attack is completely cut off and then they blossom outwards.
Yeah,
And you almost
yeah,
don't hear that kind of sound again until like Dave Fridman and the Flaming Lips in the 2000s. This is not something that was heard again throughout history. So certain compressors and things have their own certain way of responding where if you wanted to emulate something specifically, sometimes getting the right piece of gear will get you that tone. Nowadays, it's like getting at least the right family of gear, even if it's not the same specific device, because there's so many similar designs from different companies. Can you give us a sense for things like compressors and limiters that were used in the studio? What were some of the most common ones? And do you have any idea of what specific compressor might have been used on She Said for that particular almost reverse cymbal kind of sound?
sure. In general, the way that they ran the console, the way they ran the signal chain in that era, the there's only two pieces of gear. There's
Hmm.
the RS-124 EMI compressor, which is a modified Altec compressor, and
Hmm.
that was primarily used with backing tracks, including drums. So so most likely, what you are hearing on She Said is a really pushed Altec. And again, the RS-124, which was an internal modification that EMI Studios did. Um,
Hmm.
the other is the Fairchild 660,
Of
and
course.
that limiter, nowadays you would think um, limiters on high ratio signals, right? If you were
Hmm.
going to control things, compressors a little more subtle.
Hmm.
Exact inverse in the Beatles era. The compressors were used for backing tracks and instrumental stuff. The limiters were used for vocals.
Hmm.
Now, eventually, they were again they weren't or they became agnostic. Um, while I am probably in the 90th percentile certain that what you're hearing on She Said is the Altec or the RS-124. Um, Fairchild, it's got a Fairchild bloom to it, if you know what I mean.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. And yeah, with the Fairchilds, they actually have, at least nominally, a very fast attack time, which is something
Yeah,
that surprises people about Fairchilds. It's just that the knee is so soft on a Fairchild that it seems like it has a slower attack time. But if you're feeding a lot of signal into a Fairchild, you're hitting that knee at like a harder point. So if you're feeding a lot of signal into Fairchild, the attack seems faster. Because of the knee characteristics. So that's something interesting about them is that they have a nominally fast attack, But because of that gentle knee, if you're feeding them very little signal, it has the impression of a slower attack. Whereas if you feed them a lot of signal, it has the impression of a faster attack. And yeah, some of the release settings on those Fairchilds are just wacky. Like there's a whole bunch of positions in the Fairchild that almost no one uses because they're just wacky attack and release profiles. Like often people use one or two of the timing settings on them and not explore the others. So it could be a lesser used, lesser explored attack and release profile on the Fairchild. It's possible. So.
For sure. And the other thing that of course they weren't doing back then, and they didn't have the capability to do back then, was to like sidechain out the low frequencies. So
right.
so anything that hit the mic, hit the compressor or limiter.
Yep.
That's just that. This is getting your head around the fact that for the majority of these early classic recordings, that there simply is not the fineness of control that we have available, that we take for granted, and that we often resort to in our work. Those are the fundamental that you're not taking advantage of that, even if you've got a modern tool, is one of the ways that you start to get the tonalities of the classic recordings. I always joke with people of when they're talking about about a fundamental part of the overall sound, like the brightness of a recording. I say, well, if you want a classic recording, just be sure everything dies at 16K.
Yeah.
Start killing it at 14, and be sure it dies by 16. And
some of these microphones weren't even collecting much above 15K, and then a lot of the devices afterwards. Yeah, it's also amazing how little, to especially adults, rolling off 15K affects them. Because so many of us adults start to lose hearing above 16K, above the age of 35. Yeah, a lot of people aren't hearing as much above 16K as they think they are, which is ironic to me because it's usually, this is a side rant, it's usually the loudest proponents I've found of super high sampling rates are the people often who can hear the least high frequencies, which I find somewhat ironic. But this is a total digression, and I won't go there. But it's interesting. My mastering mentor, Joe Lambert, talks about liking 44.1K, it being his favorite sampling rate, because the anti-aliasing filters used, if you use an analog anti-aliasing filter, has to roll off a bit more top end. So it sounds a little bit more like tape than higher sampling rates, which I thought was an interesting argument, because that should be the biggest difference between different sampling rates, is where the anti-aliasing filter that rolls off high end slightly kicks in. So for him, he's like, I hear just a little bit less, around 18K or something out of, my converters at 44.1 than 48. So I kind of like them because of that. I thought that was interesting. But
and bragging that he could still hear 18K. Right?
Yes, right. Yes. Well, he did tell this to me 10 years ago when he was still in his 40s. Now that he's in his 50s, I have no idea. It's another funny thing about hearing like some of the best mastering engineers on the planet. Two of my favorite mastering engineers of all time, Bob Ludwig and Greg Calby. They are both at least 20 years older than me. Which means I probably have better hearing than either of them, but that does not necessarily mean that I'm a better mastering engineer than either of them. I'd like to think that I can be their equals, and that I every record that I master, I'm constantly comparing against Bob Ludwig's work, Greg Calby's work. So my references are mastered by those guys. But like objectively, if you're in your 20s or 30s, you probably have better hearing than so many of your favorite producers and engineers. But that doesn't mean you're better at listening. It doesn't matter you're better at focusing on what's really important in a record. It doesn't mean you've developed better taste or better discernment. High frequency hearing is such a small part of the puzzle compared to everything else. And that's why guys in their 60s are often still some of the biggest mixers on the planet, even though they might not hear above 15K and need their assistants to double check the high end for them.
Yeah, when we have aids for that. We have visual aids for that. For
yes, true.
For things that we can't hear. It's a great point that a lot of what makes a great recording is studying the work that you love, understanding the work that you 100%. Love, and why it hits you the way it does, both emotionally and structurally. Martin in his work with the Beatles had a principle that I describe as a time and a place for everything.
Mm-hmm.
and only a time and a place for everything. If it doesn't have a place, it's not heard. It's heard when it makes an impact. It's heard when it's necessary, and if it's not necessary, it's gone. So there are many Beatles tracks where you will hear, a piano come in, and it comes in for 4 notes, and you'll never hear that piano again.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because it was unnecessary. It didn't it there was not a place for it. And so yeah, everything in its place, you
Mm-hmm.
know. But if it doesn't have a place, why is it there? So I think, again, because of the luxury we have within a DAW of being able to have tons of tracks, tons of sounds, um, we we can lean toward dense, overproduced, over recorded content,
Mm-hmm.
and the fundamental of great hits and great, and I'm talking about pop and rock and roll here, so
Mm-hmm.
um, so don't beat me up about other genres. What about progressive? um, the key to it truly is the focus that is within the arrangement, the focus that's within the instrumentation choices, the voicing. That's what makes the difference. And
Yeah.
you'd be, if you haven't paid attention to it, and you sit down with your favorite hit song, listen to how little it takes to communicate the fundamental idea of that track,
Mm.
and how great producers and great mixers focus on those core elements to bring them out, bring them forward, and then if they're not necessary, you get rid of them.
Yeah, 100%. I think there's so much to that. I'm often harping on my idea of the mixing tiers. That there's really three different tiers of mixing. You know, A tier, B tier, and C tier, and you can think of this as being like foreground, middle ground, and background. And it's not your responsibility to, in a mix, blend everything so they seem like they're at the same depth or the same level. You said it on one of our last calls that balanced mixes or boring mixes, in the
Yeah.
respect that there should be elements that jump out and grab you. There should be a prioritization of what's really important in this song at this moment, and how do
Yep.
we draw the listener's attention to what's going to give them the most emotional payoff, while supporting it with our other elements, and not letting them get in the way. Now, we've been talking already for an hour and 15 minutes here, so I want to get some questions from the audience, if that's
Okay,
okay.
sure.
They have been
Absolutely.
standing by so patiently with their questions. So if you
Thanks,
have questions,
guys.
type them in here. And hopefully you've enjoyed my questions. Hopefully some of them are the same questions you would have asked yourself, but you get to ask your own questions now. I will give priority to both channel members and to super chats. So if you really urgently want your question answered, become a member or hit the super chat button. But otherwise, I'll go through them chronologically. So I asked some people in the beginning where you're joining us from and what are your favorite sounding Beatles albums. So we have some answers to that. If you still want to vote on your favorite sounding Beatles albums, please let us know. Um, Michael Murray writes in to say Abbey Road is hard to beat sonically, Rubber Soul or Revolver for sheer innovation. Ant-Man Felix is voting for White Album and Abbey Road. So yeah, these are common ones here. Mikkel writes in to say, I agree with Felix, White Album and Abbey Road. Michael Murray writes in saying, slightly odd request, but would love to hear about the recording of Baby You're a Rich Man on Magical Mystery Tour. I'm often amazed by how many big songs are on Magical Mystery Tour, especially on Baby I'm a Rich Man, the percussion and piano. Any thoughts about, if you can remember specifically percussion and piano on that album or that song, or how they might have approached those things on Magical Mystery Tour?
Yeah. So again, you could think of Magical Mystery Tour as Pepper on steroids. So everything they learned from Pepper, and every trick that they were starting to apply in Pepper, and we're talking about vary speed, we're talking
Yeah.
about phasing and flanging. Um, they were using. When you get to Magical Mystery Tour, there is rarely an unmodified sound.
Hmm. Hmm.
So and again, because of the level of control that they had, that they lacked, then if my backing track, which in Baby You're a Rich Man, um, I believe includes the drums and the piano as a core point of it. If I decide I want to flange that
Hmm.
piano, I'm flanging the drums too.
Right.
That's just
Yeah.
the way it works. And again, these decisions are less sophisticated than you might be led to believe.
Right. Very interesting. Yeah, Magical Mystery Tour. This is another great one. I do love, just for straight up songwriting in the pop tradition, it's hard to beat Help, Rubber Soul, and Revolver. I would have to say that Magical Mystery Tour, I like this idea of it being Sgt. Pepper's on steroids, and it does have more good songs on it than Sgt. Pepper's. For me, I still have to give Sgt. Pepper the win because it has A Day in the Life on it, which is possibly the best pop song ever written, recorded in history. I have difficulty listening to it. Like, I'm like, if I hear it come on, I'm like, oh shit, I'm gonna have to listen to the whole thing and I'm almost gonna cry. This is terrible. Turn it off. I don't want to hear it. I feel that way sometimes listening. There's certain artists, like I listened to a lot of Nirvana when I was a kid. So if Nirvana comes on, I'm like, I'm not ready to have emotions right now. Turn this music off. And that's how I feel about A Day in the Life. It is just so gripping, so brilliantly produced. And I don't think that I don't want to say that song carries Sgt. Pepper, but it elevates the status of Sgt. Pepper just for the presence of that song. But this is me going on a tangent just because I wanted to profess my love for the song A Day in the Life. All right, on to our next questions here. And if you're not a big Beatles fan, honestly, you're probably a Beatles fan if you've made it this long. I should have said this at the beginning. I wasn't always a Beatles fan. I didn't want to get into them, listen. My dad listened to them, is for older people. And then when I finally did listen to them, and really give them an honest try in my mid to late 20s, I was like, oh, crap, now I get it. So if you haven't gone through a Beatles phase at some point, you should. I wish I had said this as like my opening remarks. Every person who is involved in music should go through a Beatles phase at some point in their life, even if you're not going to become a lifelong fan, just to explore what made them such a cultural touchstone for decades to come, and what made them a phenomenon that someone growing up today might not understand the level to which the Beatles were a phenomenon. Someone born in 2015 or 2010 might not understand that. But even me, someone born in the 80s, I can look back and see how the Beatles were different than almost any other artist in the grip that they had in the popular imagination and the type of role they had in the development of popular culture for many years to come, off of what seems like, in retrospect, a flash in the pan of 8 years.
Yeah,
So,
for sure. For sure.
Enough of me pontificating. Let's get to the audience questions. Ant-Man Felix says, curious if there was more to recording the rooftop concert, like any overdubs, or if it was straight off the board. I know that Don't Let Me Down had two different vocals since they played it twice. Do you have any familiarity with those live recordings from the rooftop?
Yeah, again, the the mission statement for Let It Be was only what we can record as a band.
Yeah.
It didn't last. They were it just didn't last. So the rooftop recording, very much a live recording, but when it came to now mixing, a little bit different story. Uh, uh, the song "Get Back" is not the live rooftop recording. It's a
Hmm.
studio recording of it that was supplemented by Spectre with some studio chatter
Hmm.
from or actually from some rooftop chatter of. I'd like to say thank you on behalf of the group and myself. I hope we pass the audition.
Hmm.
That's from the live thing, but the whole song that we love, "Get Back," just rocking. What you see in Jackson's film, what you'll see upcoming in the re-released Michael Lindsay Hogg film, uh, those are not the performances of Get Back that you listen to on either the single version or the album version. Those are both
Hmm.
studio recordings, recorded at Apple
Interesting.
Studios. Yeah.
All right. Michael Murray says, another question for Jerry and Justin. The old adage is, a recording is the sound of a room with musicians in it. How much do you think the acoustics of EMI Studio 2 had to do with their overall sound?
It certainly played a bigger role in the earlier recordings. Uh, one of the uh, one of Norman Smith, who was the balance engineer in that early era, one of his secrets was uh, he had the band set up. There were no gobos or anything that were helping to isolate. It was a very open sound. the there was some drum screening, but it was a 3-sided screen, so the drums were isolated. McCartney's bass was off to Ringo's right shoulder. Some little bit of isolation from the drum screens. The guitar amplifiers were directly in front of Ringo, facing outward like a live sound,
Mm-hmm.
and uh, and uh, and Smith would use an omnidirectional U47 microphone uh, as a room mic, and he would blend that into the backing track. So so it very much, and that very much was the sound of the room as the sound of the band. Um, he brought that spirit to it. It only started getting a little bit more isolated when Emmerich took over as the balance engineer.
Mm-hmm. Uh, Another question here. Actually, this is more of a comment, but I'll add a question to it. Mikhail Zarikson says, Revolver, the first time you could really hear the bass drum. And that might not only be for the Beatles, but for a lot of popular music. Did anything change about the drum kit itself, or is it really just a change in, or the mic techniques, or is it just a change in priorities and emphasis?
Very much the miking techniques played a huge role in that change in tone. Um, for the majority of the early albums, actually up through Rubber Soul, there were only 2 microphones on the drums.
Mm-hmm.
There was either a D12, D20, or STC 4033 microphone in front of the kick, and there was either a STC 4038 or an AKG D19C as an overhead that was basically at right in front of Ringo's face, kind of centered on the entire kit. That was it. When you get to Revolver, part of Emmerich's uh, innovation was he started using more microphones on the kit. He started using an undersnare microphone. By the time you get, so that's the big difference um, is is more signals, more control of the signals going into the console. They were still, the majority of not the majority, almost exclusively all of Ringo's drum parts were summed to a single channel of audio.
Mm.
It's only when you get to Let It Be with Glenn Johns as engineer that there were 2 tracks allocated to it. It wasn't a stereo thing. It's just that he sent part of the kit one way with one mic, and he sent another part of the kit with a secondary mic, and it's shared with the guitar parts. Um, Only one real stereo recording, which was the drum solo for the end on Abbey Road. Other than that, the Ringo's drums as recorded were all recorded and summed to mono, even when they were using the solid state TG console and they had 7, they had control over 7 different microphones.
Yeah.
Still ended up on one track of tape.
This speaks to the idea of making decisions, committing, going in. And one of the things that probably makes this possible is having good monitoring. And that's one place where the acoustics of the studio would come into play, is the engineers actually listening to this stuff in the control room, being able to trust what they hear. And even with them having, by today's standards, maybe not loudspeakers as sophisticated as we might have today, I would say that the acoustic control in there is probably better than your average, bedroom control room. So that's probably something that helps them get some of the trust that they had over the decisions they were making. Because you really have to trust what you're hearing and trust that's going to translate. If you're going to make decisions about 7 mics all at once, going in live and putting it down to 1 or 2 tracks of tape.
Yeah, and like any other engineer that's worked in a more formal studio environment and worked at a studio, not traveling around, but working a studio, you learn your gear,
Yep.
and you understand the results that you get from that gear, and then you apply those lessons to whatever you're doing next,
Yeah.
as you gain knowledge. The Altec 605As that they used in the control rooms, they were always using Altec 605As or Tannoy gold monitors. The Altecs in particular, not not the finest or most sophisticated of playback environments,
Yeah.
but they understood it. They knew what it
Yes.
did. They knew what resulted from it based on what they were hearing.
Yeah, we're talking about
And
a studio full of career on-staff engineers who are going there, 9 to 5 or whatever it might have been, 5 days a week, hearing things in the same system again and again, then hearing how those records came out on the air, and having those years of experience, understanding that listening environment. You're almost better off with a bad listening environment that you know than a good one that you don't know, because
well, this
how
I
else
mean,
are you
for,
supposed? Yeah.
so they didn't have the benefit that we have today of being able to access references
Yeah.
in lots of references. They didn't have that. They didn't have that luxury.
They had trial and error on commercial releases.
Yes, they did. Yes, they did.
Different world.
Which and that goes a long way to explaining why they had such rigid processes.
Yes.
Was because they knew that worked. They knew that was not problematic. They knew that was a commercially viable sound. And when you got that figured out, you don't change the formula. Now the Beatles arguably came to change the formula, but their ability to have that option was based on their success.
Yeah. All right, a few more comments and questions here. Louisa says, I don't really have a favorite album. I usually go from Sgt. Pepper's to Magical Mystery Tour, but my favorite production is Rubber Soul. We're talking about some of their, the things that they referenced as fans. A Man Network says they were hardcore into Motown and the bass playing of James Jamerson. Here's something I've got to say. Underappreciated bassist Paul McCartney is an underappreciated bass player. He is a surprisingly good bass player in the fact that those bass lines really serve the song so well. And part of that is probably George Martin giving him feedback on his bass lines. Also, Ringo Starr, bad drummer, underappreciated drummer, or surprisingly good drummer. I'm going to say surprisingly good drummer. Like he's a good drummer who sounds like a bad drummer, or he's a bad drummer who's like good like a sneaky fox or something. Like he does things that no other drummer would do, and he does them in rhythm in a way that serves the song, but like you wouldn't hire him to imitate some other drummer. He's just going to go in and do his Ringo-y thing on it. And surprisingly just creative drummer who listens to the song rather than thinking about playing. I don't know. What would you say makes the bass playing of Paul McCartney and the drumming of Ringo Starr unique? Because this is part of what makes the Beatles unique and different from other artists, is the way the rhythms work.
Well, there's the rhythms, but there's, I think, more fundamental than that. There's serving the song.
Yeah.
There isn't, I'm a drummer, so I get to do this cool stuff, or I'm a bass player, so watch my fingers fly.
Yeah.
It is what does this song call for? And sometimes that is super straightforward. And sometimes it's crazy. Like think of the bass playing on A Little Help from My Friends, right? Like really lyrical kind of bass playing, but or in the same vein, the bass playing on Something on the Harrison song Something from Abbey Road. It is it's articulate, it's nuanced, but the bottom line was what's good for the song. What groove works for the song? What bass part works for the song? In some cases, it was just thumping on a note. Helter Skelter, bass part for Helter Skelter is the weirdest bass part. And it's essentially one note.
Yeah.
The majority of it is one note pulling along. What makes it unique is the way that it's played is the McCartney is pulling up to the note that he's landing on. So you have this wom 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 wom. He's pulling to the fixed note as opposed to bending up the note.
Yeah.
He's pulling.
He's bending into the note. Yeah.
He's bending into the note.
Yeah.
And again, that brings you this tension. That brings you this energy. That's what made the Beatles so good, was that they paid attention to the song, they paid attention to the emotion that was trying to be communicated, and they used their skills as musicians to reinforce that, as opposed to using their skills as musicians to show you how skilled they were as musicians.
Yeah. It is interesting that in a way, I wouldn't want to use this word, but it's almost like they have good, solid songwriting, but then aren't afraid to use what might otherwise be gimmicks. And what makes them not gimmicks, they have these little tricks that they do in different songs. Like there's a defining trick in certain songs. This bending up to a single note is one of many examples. But what makes them not gimmicks is because they don't do the same gimmick or the same trick necessarily again and again and again and again. Like they're trying to find a new musical trick in so many of their songs. And it's like, what can be a defining trick for this song is something that I think you can find in a lot of Beatles songs. I feel like we could go down a deep rabbit hole in that. So rather than have you expound on it, which I know that you can, I want to get to another audience question because you already gave a great example of it. So an honest question here from Bradley Ward, and this might be opening up a can of worms, so we'll see if we can give the tightest answer to it we can, is how do we capture their electric guitar sounds virtually in the box? As you were stating, their amp choices changed over the years. Maybe their approach to recording guitars changed over the years. What would you give to that answer? What do you have to know to recreate Beatles guitar sounds?
Well, all you really need to know is that primarily they were working with Vox AC30s or some flavor. You know, the biggest they got was an AC100, which was kind of got to be rejected because they were too loud for for the studio. But yeah, if you're, so Vox amps, AC30 was the standard. There are AC30 emulations that you can find out there. That's your starting point in terms of it. Again, remember that the amps are only being recorded with a single microphone, so don't get fussy. You just need one mic in front of the amp, and frankly, mic positions right in the middle of the amplifier. Right. Even if it's a multi-speaker amplifier, wherever the middle of it is.
Interesting. From how far away in that case? Because I wouldn't imagine you'd want to put it like 1 inch from the cabinet. So were there recording distances further than ours?
Yeah, they were. They were in general more in the foot to 18 inches.
Yeah. So this is Bradley actually followed up to say, oops, I meant electric guitar room sounds virtually in the box. So that's part of the answer right there, is recording guitars from a greater distance than the Shure SM57 on the grill pointing at the speaker cone, really capturing the instrument as an instrument in the room rather than just miking the speaker.
Yeah, that's it. And now, at 18 inches, let's say, that's still a close miking situation.
It is. Yeah.
So how much does room play into it? Not a ton. You could throw an impulse response, around it with a little bit of studio space.
Yeah.
When you bring all that together, unless that guitar is standing on its own, it's not anything that's going to be particularly noted. The Beatles, as they got later and later in their career, were big fans of close miking in general, close tones, immediacy. Again, you listen to the tracks, and that idea that again, a place for everything, and when that tone had its place, it was right up front. It was right in your face. That was just the way pop records were made.
Yeah. Louisa says resourcefulness was their best ability. I wish more people worked with what they had instead of plug-in hunting like crazy. Yeah, there's a balance to be had. There are certain tools where it's like there's some sounds you can only get from at least having that class of tools in your toolbox. But if you already have that class of tools in your toolbox, are you better off obsessing over having every iteration of that class of tools, or better off obsessing over the techniques and knowing in which place to use what tools might be a better return on your investment there. I think this is about all the questions we have in here. Let me see. Any other last minute questions from you guys? We're going to start wrapping it up here at about an hour and a half in. Here's one other question from Bradley, going off the topic of room mics here. He asks, was blending a room mic with a band backing track a common recording technique back then? Like with the Animals or Stones have been doing something similar. So we have this contemporary idea often of recording isolated sources with a room mic added to get more room around it. Part of my theory is that we like room mics so much today because we don't have the bleed that would naturally occur when the Beatles were recording with a whole bunch of band members in the studio. So we have to do something to get that sound. Would the Beatles have used dedicated room mics, or is the room sound coming from there being lots of open mics in the room recording other things?
Well, as I mentioned, in the earliest era with Norman Smith as the engineer, he added a room mic. He used a room mic to get an overall an overall blend of the whole band within the room.
Yes. So not a room mic for a specific instrument. We're talking about like an ensemble mic in a sense.
That's correct. They did take advantage of the room in the Pepper era. McCartney's bass tones, like the tones that we just think are just, at least I do, of, let's say again, A Little Help from My Friends, which is it's a standout because it's so up front in the mix of the song. That tone was created by having a couple of mics. It was an AKG C12 and an STC 4038. They were back about 8 feet from the bass cabinet, 8 feet from it. And McCartney turns up the cabinet and they capture that sound. So what you're hearing in that, why that tone has that roundness to it and openness to it, is because you've got you're moving air. You're actually moving air between that speaker and where the microphone is catching it.
Yeah. No, you have to pardon me because I'm reading through questions at the same time I'm listening to you, so I missed which particular track you were mentioning that on because it sounds fascinating.
That's A Little Help from My Friends.
A Little Help from My Friends. All right.
Yep.
Now I'm going to have to go re-listen to that bass sound with that in mind. Very cool. It is such a crucial part in that song. It's almost like a second lead instrument after the vocal there. Yeah.
For sure.
All right. I think we've gotten through enough questions here where we're about almost an hour and 45 minutes in, and you've done wonderfully. If you want to learn more about the specifics, you can get even more specifics with Jerry's book. I'm going to see if I can bring it up on screen here. The book is called, let me grab it here, The Beatles Recording Techniques is the short version of the title. And the long version of the title is Recreating Their Sounds in Your Home Studio or something like that. I have an Amazon link for it here in the description. You have to, here it goes, Recreating the Classic EMI Recording Studio Sound in Your Home Studio by Jerry Hammack. So if you look up the Beatles recording techniques, you'll find it. We do have in the comments here and in the description a direct affiliate link to it on Amazon. If you want to help support the podcast, that's a great way to do it. There's no extra cost to you to buy Jerry's book through there. If you're a Beatles fan who works in the studio, it's a must-have. And it starts from, I think, very basic to very advanced. I haven't read it cover to cover yet, but I've skimmed through it cover to cover and dived into certain sections. And it really does seem like you take it, like a beginner could access this book and someone who's very advanced in the studio could get something out of it. Is that something that you think is true about your book? And is that what you're going for there?
Yeah, absolutely. The idea is to introduce you to the tools and technologies they were using and their modern equivalents and emulations. And as importantly, help you understand the keys to the sound and the keys to the process that they were using, both in recording and mixing, to get the results that they got. So I walk you through all of those. I'm a very plain language kind of guy. You definitely will be helped if you've got some background in recording. But there's nothing unapproachable here, and I fully believe in demystifying the making of music, and I think I've approached this content in that way. It's not a recipe book, There's no like A plus B equals pepper bass. There's none of that. But I'll introduce you to a way to think about your recordings and technically the tools you need, that if you put them in place and you put them in place with the same intention and approach that the Beatles did, you'll gain those tones for yourself.
Awesome. A couple last quick shout outs and mentions here. One, Sound Toys for sponsoring this podcast. They're having a sale right now that actually ends today. They've got stuff for up to 50% off. You can get their whole bundle. You can get plugins as cheap as 30 or 40 bucks on sale right now that often cost well into the hundreds. So check it out. I really think you should just get the whole Sound Toys 5 bundle. It's one of the biggest steals in the world of pro audio. All of this stuff is useful. The little plate, the Echo Boy, the Filter Freak, tons of fun here. Check them out, soundtoys.com. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days. Also, big shout out and thanks to our most important sponsor, which is you. How do you sponsor this podcast? Hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. Another thing that I recommend that you do is check out one of our great full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs, Mastering Demystified, Compression Breakthroughs, EQ Breakthroughs. They are guaranteed to change the way that you work forever, for the better, or your money back. These have absolutely changed the lives of countless thousands of people who have taken them. The before and after results that I get to hear are just astounding. So I will show for my own courses till the end of the earth because I know that they actually help people. They really change lives. When you get emails, I'm sure you've gotten great emails and great feedback on your books. When you really feel like someone has taken something that you've written and applied it, it's got to be a rewarding feeling. And that's what I get on these courses all the time. And I want more of those good feelings. So go and get the courses, Mixing Breakthroughs, check them out. Also, if you want to, you can become a member of this channel. If you want access to our members-only mix feedback sessions, those happen. We have Q&As and mixed feedback sessions. There's free members-only content every month, live Q&As, live mixed feedback sessions where I can give you critiques of your own mixes, feedback, and not just from me, but our community members as well in the chat. And we give you really, really concrete ideas like EQ changes that you can make on your vocals or your kick drum, balance changes that you can make. We can compare your work to some of your favorite releases and see how they differ and what you're doing well. So I encourage you to become a member as well. Just click the join button on the bottom of your screen, or if you're not seeing it, you might be on an iOS device, in which case go into the description and find the link in there. Jerry, thank you so much for joining us. Please, again, check out his book. We've got the Amazon affiliate links for it in the description and in the comments. And if people want to follow you and catch up with what's going on, keep track of what you're doing, what are the best places to keep up with Jerry Hammack?
Oh, I'm out there on Facebook and just my name, nothing fancy, Jerry Hammack. You can follow me there. And if you want to learn more about the books, there's the Beatles Recording Reference Manuals.com and BeatlesRecordingTechniques.com will give you a lot of information.
Sweet. Thank you, Jerry, again for being here on this channel and giving us all your Beatles knowledge and wisdom. It's been absolutely great having you here. Would have you again anytime. Thank you guys for hanging out with us. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop with Jerry Hammack. See you next time.